Hello y'all, this is Louie and welcome back for a brand spanking new episode of Retrosaurus. I thought I'd follow up our Donkey Kong 64 video with a slightly more positive take on another classic game that keeps in line with the Rareware school of gameplay design. Banjo-Kazooie was one of the first games to really give Super Mario 64 a run for its money, in the 3D gaming realm at least. Though to be fair, Mario 64 really isn't as good as you remember it either, but back then it was the standard in the industry. Banjo-Kazooie is easily one of my favorite games on the console, though nothing will really ever hold a candle to my beloved Snowboard Kids 2. Banjo-Kazooie was yet another one of those games I loved but never owned, only recently getting my own cartridge of the damn thing a couple weeks back. I did manage to snag my own digital copies of it and its sequel on the 360 when they were remastered in HD. I am using remastered very loosely here, as those versions sadly have lost some of the visual charm that was present on my rose-tinted tube TV. That being said, this recent time with the N64 version of our subject is quite a bit different than I remember it being, and it took some time to really figure out the cause. As I've had the chance to revisit this game on stream, my opinions of it now compared to my comments in the DK64 video are a bit different. I gave it nearly glowing reviews, glossing over one of the more frustrating aspects of the game and not even mentioning several others. Unlike DK64, Banjo-Kazooie is a nearly perfect example of how to do a collectathon style game without being a completely disjointed mess like its banana-themed successor. The key word here is nearly, and for several very good reasons. I can honestly say this is the first time in Retrosaurus history where I've caught myself in my own nostalgia trap, and heck do I feel like a proper butt munch. This honestly came as a surprise to myself, as the last time I remembered playing through and completing the game, I had very few issues with it. I've since then remembered the reason for that, which we will get into later. So with Banjo-Kazooie as our canvas, I want to explore two key elements of collectathon style games that can make or break a player's experience: core gameplay loop and level design. These elements are important to all types of video games, but when it comes to collectathons, these two ideas are completely dependent on each other. If one aspect fails, the other will suffer. So join me as we re-enter Gruntilda's lair and get ready to take some notes as we explore the levels of imperfection of Banjo-Kazooie. I've gone into a skosh of detail about BK before in the previous episode, so instead I want to look at how BK came into existence before jumping into our main subject. The character Banjo the Bear himself debuted in another Rare developed title on the N64 known as Diddy Kong Racing, a Mario Kart-esque clone that I do not remember having any fond memories of. Honestly, looking back at my childhood, I really didn't like anything associated with Donkey Kong. My first foray into that series was Donkey Kong Land, a Game Boy pseudo-port / escort title for the DK franchise that borrowed many aspects from DK Country, but with its own level design and frustrating gameplay. Honestly, I recommend checking out the DK Land series because it still frustrates me to this day of how difficult the game is with stiff mechanics and crowded visuals. God, I need to stop getting off topic. I just go on tangents. There's no one here to reel me in and give me a firm smack. Alright, so despite debuting in Diddy Kong's game alongside Conquer the Squirrel, two characters who already had their own games, our boy Banjo was never intended to be the star of his own game. The original pitch for Banjo-Kazooie was known as Dream, Land of Giants, a fantasy-inspired action RPG initially slated for the Super NES. The game was intended to feature the same visual style as DK Country, with a human protagonist wielding a sword alongside a canine companion. The duo, named Edson and Dinger respectively, each had their own set of moves and abilities to solve puzzles to progress through the world. The game was in development hell for years and eventually was moved to the N64, where it went through several dramatic redesigns, eventually combining the duo's unique skills into one playable character. With Dinger out of the picture, Edson too was replaced by a bear-like creature who would become Banjo, with Kazooie being added to the game somewhere around this time as well. The game was renamed to just simply Kazoo and took on a more 2.5D platformer design. 2.5D in this case is a side-scrolling game that used the depth of the environment, yet retaining the fixed camera angle of 2D platformers on the side. As development continued, the release and success of Super Mario 64 inspired the dev team to switch to a fully 3D approach while retaining many of the visual aspects and themes such as pirates and puzzles that date back to the original concept of dreams. Thus, Banjo-Kazooie was born, and thank God it is what it is, because the original pitch feels incredibly generic in my opinion. The Banjo series has 5 entries in total, not counting re-releases or remasters. I bet you didn't know that, did you? How many did you think there were? 3? Well, most people would probably just say 2 because no one except for me liked Nuts and Bolts, which was a fine game in its own right. It just should not have been a Banjo-Kazooie game, even by the developer's own admission. The first 2 games, Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie, released 2 years apart from each other on the N64 in 1998 and 2000 respectively. These 2 titles would later be given enhanced HD remasters that restored some of the scrapped features from early development, such as Stop and Swap, and connected with the then upcoming Nuts and Bolts. After Rare was sold off to Microsoft in 2002, they continued working on both the DK and BK series on Nintendo handhelds before finally dropping Nintendo support entirely following the release of Viva Pinata Pocket Paradise. As for Banjo, one canonical entry and one racing spin-off were produced for the GBA, not the Game Boy Advance. I've lost count how many times I've heard that and it's just plain wrong. Stop it. Get some help. Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge was released in 2003 and took place between Kazooie and Tooie and involves some kind of time travel BS and kinda made sense. Honestly, I don't remember a whole heck of a lot about the plot, but the game itself retains much of the feel and core design of the series, but in a top-down, almost isometric approach. Banjo Pilot was the final original GBA game they produced, which was surprisingly incepted as a Diddy Kong Racing sequel entitled Donkey Kong Racing, but was reskinned after the buyout. The game really doesn't have any story, so its canonicity isn't important. I'm beginning to think that Donkey Kong is going to be the new Capcom of Retrosaurus, with as many references as I'm having to make for it. The fifth and final entry in the series is the infamous Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts for the Xbox 360, which completely issued the entire design philosophy of the series, preserving only some collectathon aspects. Nuts and Bolts is notable for being incredibly polarizing in the fandom, as it barely resembles what made the series unique amongst its peers, opting for vehicle-based challenges and downplaying any on-foot gameplay by removing the traditional 3D platforming. But what are these core design elements that are found throughout the series that would cause such an uproar and hatred from the fans? As it took many cues from Super Mario 64 before it, I'll briefly touch upon that game for a bit of background before we get into Banjo-Kazooie. Super Mario 64 gave the players nearly everything they needed to get through the game immediately, with only about 3 or so different hat powers that needed to be unlocked and would be available only in specific areas of the game. Collectibles were limited to red and blue coins, 1-up mushrooms, and power stars, which made it fairly simple to achieve a 100% completion for most players. The simplistic design made the game very straightforward and easy to pick up, albeit very basic in terms of depth. There's a reason this game is still held in high regard compared to even more recent titles in the Super Mario series. You pick a level, you collect coins, complete the objective, and you earn a power star. The more power stars you have, the more levels open up, the more progress you can make in Peach's castle. It's a simple gameplay loop that's fun and effective at keeping you hooked in and perfectly translates the feel of the 2D games in the process. Taking these ideas a step forward, Banjo-Kazooie features a multitude of collectibles and character upgrades you earn throughout the story. Like Mario, there's a fun core gameplay loop, but with a bit more depth and a twist. Unlike its inspiration, Banjo-Kazooie starts players off with a handful of basic moves, with new moves being taught to the player by Bottles the Mole in each world, to tackle the new layouts and hurdles each introduced. There are 2 primary collectibles scattered throughout each level that are required to get the player through Grunty's lair: music notes and puzzle pieces called Jiggies. Each level has 100 notes and 10 Jiggies, totaling 900 and 100 respectively, then unlock new areas and worlds for Banjo and Kazooie to explore. Jiggies can be earned in a variety of ways. You can find them hidden in each world, complete mini-games or tasks for NPCs, or find all 5 colorful lost Jinjos. One major difference between Super Mario 64 and Banjo is you can complete all the objectives in a level without having to start over each time. Some collectibles may require the players to traverse difficult platforming sections or take to the sky, requiring you to track down Bottles in each level, which he thankfully reminds you about each time you enter a level if you missed him. Occasionally you'll need to meet up with Mumbo Jumbo, the resident shaman, to transform you into various creatures or objects to reach areas our bear and bird duo cannot normally enter. Now, one of my major criticisms of this game comes from the collecting aspect of the collectathon, but not due to the sheer amount of things you'll find. Keep in mind that as we move forward, the core gameplay loop of Banjo-Kazooie is not too different from Mario, but a bit more fleshed out. Enter the world, learn the moves, collect all the notes, find all the Jiggies, make your way to the next world, and repeat. Just try not to die along the way. The game thankfully keeps track of totals of all the collectibles you nab in each world, but sadly not a detailed account of which ones you have and which ones you don't. It's definitely worth mentioning that there is no map whatsoever in this game, so make sure you learn the lay of the land just in case you miss something. Which brings me to our next topic, level design. The world and level design of Banjo-Kazooie are easily the most memorable aspects of this game, second only to the incredible sound design and music composed by the legendary Grant Kirkhope. Each world has a unique theme and atmosphere that, while not having much relation to each other, doesn't have the same generic feeling of the world of Super Mario 64. Just a side note on that comment, the levels in Super Mario 64 aren't terrible, but so many of them feel generic and proof of concept that only a few really stick out in memory when I think of the game. I'll save my complaints for that game for another day, but it's definitely overrated in some respects. Banjo and Kazooie's quest begins as they leave their home, the tutorial zone known as Spiral Mountain, and quickly links the player into Gruntilda's lair, the hub area and primary location in the game. Within the lair, 9 uniquely themed worlds can be found gated behind music note doors and unlocked by completing Jiggy puzzles. The difficulty of traversal found in each world increases as you move further and further into the lair, requiring more collectibles and moves as you go. Although the game is more or less well balanced in the early levels, the game spikes in difficulty towards the end of the game. As more verticality is introduced and more hazards get in your way, the game can easily cross into the tedious territory, as the restrictive nature of early 3D camera and controls can often lead you to making many missteps. There definitely is something about the final 2 worlds that are so infuriating in terms of design. It makes me question how the developers landed on some of the core gameplay aspects, knowing full well how frustrating and padded out the end of the game would feel. Like I said earlier in the video, the last time I played this game, I didn't have many issues with the game outside of my general laziness as an early 20-something to finish games. Really, it wasn't until my mid-20s that I began playing games to completion more often than not. My teenage years were a nightmare for anyone who hung out with me, as I'd swap games every 20 minutes or so because of my terrible attention span. It probably would have been worse if I had the same setup as I do now, as modern consoles can have multiple games downloaded and installed to the system, which would make swapping games on the fly relatively simple. But really, nothing beats the tactile aspect of swapping discs or cartridges. And speaking of cartridge games, what exactly was it about the N64 version that kept me from finishing the game as a kid, but wasn't a factor in the 360 version? It all comes down to the combination of core gameplay loop and level design choices. Let's review the core gameplay loop. Enter the world, learn all the moves, collect all the notes, find all the jiggies, make your way to the next world, and repeat. Try not to die. There it is, right there. Try not to die. Now, it should go without saying that in most games, you would want to die or game over as little as possible, right? Well, for most modern games, typically when you die, there would be some sort of saving aspect of an autosave or a checkpoint, so some of your progress would be retained. Even in some older games, dying would still let you keep some of your progress given you met certain conditions. In Donkey Kong Country, for example, tagging the checkpoint barrel in a level would allow you to start over at that exact point in the event that you died, assuming you had extra lives. You'd retain all the bananas, animal statues, medals, and Kong letters you earned up until that point. Donkey Kong Country came out on the Super Nintendo in 1994, 4 years prior to the release of Banjo-Kazooie. Unlike that Rare-developed SNES predecessor, Banjo-Kazooie does not treat the players quite as kindly. Sure, all the jiggies you collect will remain on your person, but other collectibles will not. With the exception of jiggies and things like mumbo tokens, every single collectible in the game respawns upon your death. In fact, the levels return to nearly their original state when you die. So say you were making some progress across Bubble Goop Swamp to feed the Golden Gator some eggs. Hush, I'm saying it right, leave me alone. You will have to start the challenge over again in the event the swamp piranhas take more than a single munch out of your butt. So while the game makes a note of each individual music note that you pick up for a high score total, because for some reason it has unique identifiers for each music note, it does not remove them from the game world upon reset. Say you get 99 of those heckers in a given world, then die. Get ready to collect them all again. Now early in the game, levels are fairly small and not too difficult to traverse, but as more hazards and verticality are introduced, things get quite a bit trickier. This issue was remedied in the 360 version where notes and Jinjos did not respawn upon death, but that doesn't really make later parts of the game that much easier, just less wasting of your time. Now, I'm going to call out 2 worlds specifically, not that one, that are the biggest offenders of the questionable design in this game, as they actively work against the core gameplay loop and effectively make the game experience heck for players. Rusty Bucket Bay and Click Clock Wood are the 2 final levels in the game. Rusty Bucket Bay is a hazard-heavy level with pitfall deaths that are just itching to force the player into a world reset. There's even a saying in the fandom: collect all the notes in the engine room first in Rusty Bucket Bay. It's not really a catchy saying, but it's the most common advice given to any new players that come around. Click Clock Wood, on the other hand, features 4 alternative versions of a single level, with most collectibles being specific to a particular in-level season. Dying in any of these seasonally themed nightmares will force the player to revisit each season to recollect any lost notes or Jinjos. Click Clock Wood was the infuriating replay killer to me in my most recent run through of the game for a 100% save file. And I know what you're going to tell me. You don't need to 100% the game, so some of these issues are non-issues for most players, fair enough. You only need 94 jiggies and 675 of those notes to fight the final boss, so you have plenty of wiggle room to beat the game. But ignoring the bad game choices does not delegitimize them. It's kind of like mentioning that DK64 isn't a bad game as long as you only do the bare minimum to complete it. When the core gameplay loop is roadblocked or invalidated by level design of a collectathon, the game is inherently flawed. This is a common theme with Rareware's games, as they just seem to patch certain problems while never identifying and resolving the core complaints. After extensively covering DK64 over the past month, and jumping back into the Banjo-Kazooie series now, there's just something about how Rareware approached their game design philosophy that just boggles my mind. Each game they made featured bigger and more expansive levels, thus creating a void that would need to be filled with even more and more collectibles. While the core gameplay loop has often stayed the same, it never really seemed to catch up with the ever-increasing size of the games themselves. DK64, for example, yet again fixed the respawning collectible issue by making all pickups permanent. However, the level design for that world became more tedious and annoying with the introduction of 4 additional playable characters with unique movements and abilities. Even games like Cameo, Elements of Power, and Nuts and Bolts never really learned much from their predecessors, as there was always something fundamentally flawed about those games that kept them from achieving mass critical success. Their design philosophy, while charming and engaging, never really evolved or improved enough over the years. I can't even forgive Banjo-Kazooie's issues based on the hardware it released on, as many of the other games made for the hardware were able to overcome these issues. Honestly, I think this is just another rare issue that went unsolved for years. Remember how DK64 came bundled with an expansion pack because they couldn't figure out the memory leak issue? You can even see this flawed design philosophy at work in Playtonic Studios' Yooka-Laylee, a game developed by former key figures of classic Rareware. Yooka-Laylee was a Kickstarter game that promised to revive the collectathon genre on modern consoles with a Banjo-Kazooie style spiritual successor, and they delivered exactly what they promised. The game, while charming and visually pleasing, still retains many of the core issues present in many of Rare's classic games. Even after several decades of making these games, they've never really listened to any criticism or taken to heart any critiques they've been given. I know this entire video is just going to come across as some unabashed hatred for Rare and their games, but I only complain because I love them so much. If you are truly a fan of something, you need to be willing to be critical of it and identify its faults. Otherwise, you just feed into a hive mind mentality where certain games are untouchable. Nintendo fandoms often fall into this trap where they take any bit of criticism as a personal attack. Just try and tell any of the Nintendo subreddits that you didn't think Breath of the Wild was the best game ever made. I encourage any of y'all to take a critical lens at your all-time favorite game and really dig deep to identify the bad and good aspects of it. Every game has its own flaws and issues, but that doesn't make them necessarily bad, just, well, flawed. Just remember that there's no such thing as a perfect game, no matter how highly a game scores or how much fun you have with it. Well, except for Snowboard Kids 2, and you're an idiot if you think otherwise. Alright, that's it for this episode of Retrosaurus. Make sure to let me know in the comments what you think. If there's a game you'd like to see me tackle next, let me know in the comments as well. I'm always looking for a new retro game to challenge my beliefs. A like and a subscription do go a long way, in addition to supporting on Patreon, which keeps the series going. Make sure to check me out on all my different social channels at KyoryuHunter, which is easier to spell than it is to say. And once again, thank you so much for watching this episode of Retrosaurus. I will see you next time. Goodbye.